This is your Irish Diary, presenting the romance and reality of Irish life then and now. Áuric Éireann, or Irish Diary, is presented by the Patrick Butler Family Foundation of St. Paul. Professor John McKiernan of the College of St. Thomas in St. Paul is writer and narrator.
We might call this the story of a bell that has not stopped ringing for almost 1,500 years. This is the story of St. Patrick, and the story of a bell too, but more about that later. You know, St. Patrick, in many ways, might be called a New Yorker. At least the New Yorkers seem to have adopted him in a grand way every March 17th. The line of parade there is far greater than you'd find at any place in the world, including Ireland. So in another way, St. Patrick might be called a New Yorker, a typical New Yorker, because he wasn't born in Ireland any more than New Yorkers seem to be born in New York. St. Patrick's influence, we know and we've experienced and we've seen, we've observed, is worldwide. There are towns named after him. There are, of course, thousands of churches in the Orient, in the Occident, named after St. Patrick. This man seems to have got around, and his influence, if the New York parade means anything, has not been lost on this country of ours. However, we find even Shakespeare uses the name St. Patrick. If you've read your Hamlet later, you may remember the oath that Hamlet takes. Yes, by St. Patrick, he says. And there's a story behind that too, but we're not dealing with Shakespeare or with St. Patrick in Shakespeare. But something about this man, something about his influence, something of the great mystery that surrounds his name. And before we begin to delve into that mystery, we might possibly draw an interesting parallel between, shall we say, the Irish and the Jews, between Patrick and Abraham. Both were the fathers of nations. Both were at least the spiritual fathers of nations. Both of them came to possess a promised land. And in this sense, their patriarchal figures still dominate the history of these nations. And then we might draw other parallels between the Irish and the Jews, and maybe the Irish and the Greeks even. For instance, Moses has come and gone, and no man knows his burial place. Yet he was a great leader of his nation. And so too with Patrick. No man knows his burial place, although often it is said that he is buried here, beneath a slab in the northern part of Ireland. This giant stone slab, reputedly the birthplace not only of Patrick, but also of two other famous Irish saints whom I'll mention in a moment. And yet, there's no certainty about any of this at all. No certainty that Patrick is there. In fact, we have more reason perhaps to doubt it than to believe it. And in that sense, he reminds us not only of Moses, but possibly also of Homer. Homer, dead, you know, was fought over by 7 cities. Everyone claimed his birthplace, but while he was alive, no one cared. So too it would almost seem with Patrick, because we have no surety, no certainty of his birthplace. And now that he's dead, and the great apostle, well, France would like to claim his birthplace, Scotland, Wales, England. We can be certain of only one thing, and that is, like the typical New Yorker, he wasn't born in his own now native Isle. I mentioned a moment ago something that you all know, that of course he's the great patron of Ireland and of Irishmen. But you know, he shares an interesting Trinitarian relationship in this respect, because the Irish heroes at least in this instance, and in others too, I'm afraid. But in this instance, the Irish heroes come in threes. And you may know Joyce Kilmer's Trees, and you may not know of another poem of Joyce Kilmer's in which he celebrated the great saints of the Gael. The three of them, Patrick, Columkill, or Columba in Latin, and Bride, or Brigid in English. These are the three great saints, and this centuries-old print illustrates that even 4 and 5 centuries ago, they appeared publicly in print as the heroes of Ireland, the religious heroes, the spiritual heroes. And reputedly, the three of them are buried in that common grave under that monolithic slab which you saw some minutes ago. I say reputedly, and that's as far as we can go. Who was this man, if we know so little about him? Whence came he? When did he come to Ireland? When did he die? There's so much about the man that is not known. And you might say the same is true of Shakespeare. The little that we know about him seems to cement him firmly in 5th century history in Ireland, without any doubt about the broad general outline, but with considerable doubt about the particular details. Where did he come from? Who was he? Was he one man, or two, or three? All of these have been theories about him. Who was he? Well, I'll settle for the fact that he was born in what is now Britain, possibly in Wales. I'll settle for this. You may have a different argument. That he was captured in a slave raid by Irish warriors who used to terrorize the western coast of Britain. Captured in one of these raids, brought back to Ireland. This much we can get from his own documents. You see, Patrick did leave behind him very little in one sense and quite enough in another. He left behind him 2 documents. One called his confession, his confessio, in which there is some autobiographical information. And another, a letter, or epistle, to use the Latin word, the epistle to Coroticus, a British chief who had raided Ireland and taken away some of Patrick's Christians after Patrick had converted them to a meeker kind of life than they had customarily led. Well, this isn't too much to know about Patrick, and yet it can be filled out. We know from his own education that there was a decided Roman influence in his own family. That is, that his father was no doubt a fairly well-educated man, that in these last days of the early 5th century, when the Romans were beginning to withdraw from England, there was still enough of an imprint of Roman civilization left for Patrick to have come in contact with it. And yet by no means was England or Wales completely Christianized, so that Patrick wasn't himself living in a fervid Christian community, although it appears that his home environment was Christian. And yet Patrick tells us, we don't know with how much of the exaggeration of the convert, but Patrick tells us in his confession that at this period of his youthfulness, he was not much of an example of Christian living. At any rate, possibly about the age of 16, he was taken by force and sold as a slave in the north of Ireland, where he tended sheep. And traditionally, in this area, which is called, the far mountain in the background at any rate, is called Mount Slemish. And in this closer view, one notes its characteristic and easily recognized shape. Patrick tended sheep here, according to the traditional story, for several years before being advised by vision to flee the country and make his way to an appointed place on the eastern coast of Ireland, and there take ship. He followed this out. And again, in its broad outlines, although we don't have the details, we have this verification in Patrick's own words. But whether he went then to his own people in Britain, or whether he went first to France, we can't be entirely sure. But we know he did go to France, and there studied to become ordained. And he tells us that these days and nights were filled with the visions and the voices of the Irish, calling him back. So he conceived this tremendous vocation to return, to bring to the Irish the benefits of Christianity. He was not the first Christian missionary to labor in Ireland, but he was the most successful, and the one who labored perhaps not only most successfully, but perhaps most untiringly, because he was a dynamic man, one of these rare geniuses in the world whose life is so inspiring to the rest of us. I hope to come to a little of this. Patrick returned then to Ireland and traveled fairly extensively throughout the country, although probably not so extensively as the place names, which are liberally scattered all over the country, would seem to indicate. We have any number of places and any number of natural sites like wells and so on connected with St. Patrick, but he probably didn't get to them all. He traveled liberally, and he was eminently successful, so that when he died, it would seem to be true that there were pockets of pagans left in the country, but the country was saved, if you will, for Christianity. Whereas when he had first arrived, there were only pockets of Christians. So he completely, in the short space of his labors, and the estimate varies, the figures run 30, 40, 50 years, 60 years, but in this period, he completely reversed the religious position or situation which he had found. This still doesn't solve some of the mysteries. Traditionally, there was one Patrick, and he came to Ireland in 432, traditionally. On the other hand, there are some modern historians who claim that there were probably two Patricks, one following upon the other, and both of them laboring in the common cause. This is hotly disputed, or perhaps I shouldn't say hotly. When scholars get together, there is some heat, but one would hope that it's also nothing but cool reason. So it is debated at the moment. And this is still quite different from the 19th century view. In the 19th century, the argument ran that Patrick hadn't existed at all, and in some instances, that there had been as many as 3 Patricks. So the 19th century theories have more or less been thrown out for the want of the kind of substantiation which we get from our historical studies. Currently, the argument resolves itself into 2 positions: that there was one Patrick as we know him traditionally, and the broad outlines of his life are accurate. The other, that there were 2 Patricks, one who labored for a short space of time, and another who labored longer and more successfully, and who indeed may have given his name to the previous man. That is, he may have assimilated the previous man's existence and personality into his own. So successfully did he operate. Well, those theories aside, let us now go back to the 5th century world and consider what it was like. Rome was tottering. The ancient glorious empire was calling back its legionnaires from England, calling them in from the northern borders. Rome was to be sacked in this century by barbarians. So the old classical world was tottering. Christianity seemed to be well entrenched in this new world, this post-classical world, and yet Christianity was torn by schism and heresy. The Christian lands of Italy and Gaul, Rome and Spain, part of England, all that North African shore on the Mediterranean, these lands, though nominally Christian, and of course the lands in the East, in Greece and so on, though nominally Christian, were suffering the divisiveness of heresy and schism. Into this world, then, a world of political disorder, of religious unrest, into this world Patrick came. And when he departed at the end of the 5th century, he had given to this Christendom, or this Christian world, a remarkably firm Christian outpost or bastion on the western defenses of Christianity, so that within a few centuries of his death, this Christian outpost was to return to Europe, to rekindle the faith, to bind up the wounds left after heresy and schism, to send its wandering missionaries as far east as Russia and right down into the toe of Italy. Missionaries who were to leave their names behind them in towns still named after them in Austria, Germany, Poland, Western Russia, Italy, France, Spain, and Portugal. A remarkable accomplishment. And this is the glory, of course, of that man. Now, this isn't all. I don't intend to turn our visit into a discussion only of the religious aspects of Patrick and his mission to Ireland. I'd like to extend this completely to show the impact that Patrick has had in the world through his influence upon one nation. So aside from this great achievement, and I don't intend to minimize it, though I am leaving it at the moment, aside from this great achievement, Patrick left behind him a rock-ribbed position in international folklore. I'll illustrate it from Irish folklore. In the first place, he merged with the pre-Christian and pagan gods of Ireland, so that some of the old Celtic gods like Lugh, whose name is left in the continent, let's say, in the town of Leiden, but this old Celtic god of Lugh, after a while just melted, as it were, into the shadow of Patrick, and Patrick's personality tended to replace him. So that I could, I think, entertain you, but whether it's entertaining or not, I could at least tell you many, many stories about St. Patrick, which in reality, when these are carefully sifted by scholarship, we discover are nothing more than assimilated pagan tales, so that he's firmly entrenched in Irish and international folklore. In addition, he comes down to us in a marvelous Irish tale, which I wish that you might all read. This was retold in our time, in the 20th century, by Darrell Figgis, F-I-G-G-I-S, in a story called The Return of the Hero. The book is out of print, but you may get it in some of your libraries. The Return of the Hero. This is a retelling of an old Irish folk tale, if you will, because it has been captured by the folk, although it came to be written down and has come down to us, perhaps we should call it now, a work of literature. It was called the Colloquy, or the Dialogue, of the Ancients. And it tells the story of Patrick, remember, 5th century, of Patrick toiling away in Ireland, and miraculously one day meeting one of the old Fenians. Now, the Fenians had been there 2 centuries and more before. And the dialogue between Patrick and the Fenians is uproariously funny. Oisin, the son of Finn MacCool, is the man with whom Patrick carries on his dialogue. And there's a great deal of good-natured banter about Christian customs. Oisin, who lives, you know, as a survivor of that pagan, lusty tradition of vitality and heroism and full physical expression, fighting, hunting, and so on, enjoying, in other words, the fruits of the natural universe. Oisin says to Patrick one day, "Why do you people fast? This is disgusting." Because Patrick was trying to convince him that he should fast during Lent. Well, poor Patrick has a hard time trying to explain to the pagan. It's a funny story. It would take me over an hour, perhaps, to retell you the whole thing. I just mention it as an example. I can't perhaps go without mentioning another part of it. Patrick is trying to convert Oisin. And he tells Oisin that the Fenians whom Oisin worships, they're all in hell. Well, that makes hell quite an attractive place then for Oisin. He wants to go where they are, because these puny Christians, with their fasting and their strange customs and their withdrawal from the natural life, all of these things repel the old pagan. And he's sick and tired one day of hearing Patrick talk about God and the might of his God. And he says to him, "Bring your God down here, and you claim to have such great power. Bring back my son Oscar, and if your God can pin my son Oscar to the ground in a wrestling match, then I'll believe in him." Well, it's filled with this. It's delightful. It was written down by the Christian monks in Ireland, possibly as early as the 10th century. But I quote it, as I said before, as an illustration of the fact that not only did Patrick, in the space of one lifetime, leave behind him an enduring bulwark of Christendom, but he found his way into folklore. He found his way into the artwork of Ireland. At the beginning of this program, you saw that simple cowbell. This traditionally, you know, bells and Christianity have a close association, and this traditionally was the bell that Patrick used. Well, there was such veneration for it in Ireland that it was artistically covered, if you will. This, you can see the sheet metal manufacture of it here, crude enough. But then it was put into an elaborate case with jewels and precious work of all sort, gold filigree, which you can see possibly in a close-up of the detail. This magnificent metal work that Ireland was so well known for, particularly in the 11th and 12th centuries. An example of how Patrick inspired the artwork. And other shrines associated with Patrick is this shrine of Patrick's hand. It was theoretically, of course, the shrine of his arm, the bone of his arm and his hand. And in this close-up, possibly, one can appreciate it a bit more. So that Patrick not only found himself in folklore, but also in many, many examples of Irish artwork. He became, of course, as we know, the representative in the United States of America of the Irish, so that we humorously and sometimes denigratingly speak of the Irish as Paddies, a rather glorious name. The Friendly Sons of St. Patrick, a rather old organization, as old indeed as the American state. And we might remember that at one time George Washington issued orders that in honor, as it were, of the thousands of Irish who were fighting for the cause of independence, George Washington one day, St. Patrick's Day, ordered that the password that day at the camp be St. Patrick. So this is another example of the man's effectiveness, of his impact, of his memory. Now, his memory has preserved a faith in Ireland that is exemplified in other ways. In Irish, for instance, if you want to say hello to someone, you are likely to say "Dismuirecht," which translated into English is "God and Mary be with you." And the answer is "Dismuirecht is Pádraig," God, Mary, and Patrick be with you. You don't go out of your way to use this greeting. This is the ordinary greeting. It has no relevance to your religion. So that it's a living testimonial, you see, of the tenaciousness of this man's memory, that he has been swallowed up even into the daily customs. This is further illustrated in the religious life of Ireland in the fact that today, in the 20th century, both the Irish and the Dutch, interestingly, lead Christendom in the numbers of religious priests, brothers, and sisters or nuns whom they export to the rest of the world. Now, finally, I should like to say that he has left his name behind in literature, in a very charming poem that I should like to read with you. There's a story about the poem that I can tell a little bit later. This particular card was a souvenir, a 1961 souvenir, it's several years old now, of the year of St. Patrick, coming up, you see, to the celebration of the 1500th year in 1962. But if you would look at the words now, and I will read a few of them to you. They are, of course, in Irish. Christ liam, Christ roem, Christ muye, Christ unum, Christ fum, Christos machin, and so on. Now I'll translate it into English. Christ with me, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ in me, Christ under me, Christ over me, Christ on my right hand, Christ on my left hand, and so it goes. The poem, which is quite long, this is only a slight excerpt. The poem is called The Deer's Cry, and reputedly, this fervid religious expression, the section I read you dealing with Christ, the rest of it dealing with the Trinity, this fervid religious expression one day saved the life of St. Patrick. When he was going to the king at Tara, the royal seat of Ireland, a plot was laid to murder him along the way. And Patrick, having become acquainted with it, chanted this song, so that the Druid's henchmen who lay in wait to slay him never saw Patrick and his party pass by. They waited for hours in vain. And in the meantime, St. Patrick reached the king's court safely, where he delivered his sermon and so on. When the henchmen of the Druids returned, they said they had seen nothing but a herd of deer. And this poem is called The Deer's Cry. And through the chanting of this, St. Patrick and his party miraculously had been changed into deer. The poem is The Deer's Cry.
If you would like a list of selected readings to add to your enjoyment, please send a self-addressed stamped envelope to Professor John McKiernan, College of St. Thomas, St. Paul, Minnesota. This program has been presented as a public service by the Patrick Butler Family Foundation and produced at KTCA-TV, Minneapolis, St. Paul.